think we are live now. So welcome everyone. This is the Quant University guest lecture series. I know the last few months we have been having multiple discussions on agentic AI and generative AI, primarily for financial professionals. Many of our audience have come from either the first line of defense or the second line of defense, and they're all kind of dabbling with what SR 26.2 means to them, and also kind of catching up with all the new innovations which are happening. And I don't know how many of you are working on Fable. I'm enjoying the whole revolution because many things which were kind of, well, it's going to work, it will work someday, are now like, well, it will work, and how do we tweak it, kind of a thing. And the amount of architectural decisions which are needing to happen, not just from a quant or a developer's perspective, but also from a validator's perspective, it's just been fascinating to see the development in the last few years. For me, as an educator, as a practitioner, it's not only kind of looking at what actually needs to be done, it's also about contextualizing it in what does it mean in the profession. How do we make sure that the things we are doing from a financial services perspective could be things which we can look at it from a practitioner's perspective and make sure that we are not letting go of all the bells and whistles we have with respect to regulations, but also kind of understanding the nuances and the limitations of the technology. So we have been running a cohort on generative AI in finance for model risk professionals, and we have had practitioners from multiple companies joining in, and some of the companies which are represented in here. And we have had wonderful feedback on what's being taught, and also we have had amazing guest lecture series. So today is the second guest lecture. Scott is going to be, I'm going to introduce Scott in a second. So, he's going to be working primarily, or talking primarily on the use of generative AI and, does it even mean validation at that point in time. But then next week we have a 2-hour workshop with Agus. Agus has been, as you know, he's a prolific creator and also has the knowledge in the context of both the theory side of things, but also on the practitioner side of things. So he's been working on some cool stuff on agentic AI, and he's going to be primarily talking about building production-ready agents. So it's a 2-hour workshop, so he's going to be doing it next Thursday. And then Jacob is going to cap off this particular cohort on the use of generative AI in the financial services industry. So if you're interested, go to our website. I'm going to post a link and make sure that you're signed up for the whole series. And for people who missed out on the first cohort, we actually, by popular demand, are starting a second cohort on July the 21st. It's a 4-week cohort, a lot of labs, 16 hours of learning, a lot of fundamentals on generative AI, but also agentic AI side of things, testing, evaluation, and guardrails, and the governance aspect associated with it. So I'm going to throw in a link, and hopefully you will be able to join us on in the second cohort, and I hope to see you all in the classroom there. So today I want to take a minute to invite Scott Eilerts back. So Scott and I, so it's just been like 5 years already, Scott. I forget, that when we met in New York, was it you were at Discover? Was it 2020?
Yeah, I believe so. It seemed like it was during the pandemic and when you were starting
It
to
was
rent
just
your.
I don't think the pandemic had started because it was the day if I remember correctly, it was in February or March of 2020, and I'd taken my full train from Boston to New York, and Scott was still at Discover, and he took my class on AI risk management, or machine learning risk management as we called it at that time. And then I took my train back home, and it was an empty train, and I was wondering what's happening, and it was like the start of the pandemic, and time has flown by. In the last 5 years, a lot of things have happened, both on the way we work, but also how kind of things have changed in the artificial intelligence world. So when I was teaching a course on AI risk management for George Mason University, Scott and I reconnected, and he did an amazing presentation grounding how do we bring all these aspects of generative AI, but also in the context of validation. And I love the presentation, and the participants of the class love the presentation. So we thought we'll invite Scott back to the guest lecture series. And now he's at AG Accredit or AG Credit. I don't know how to say that. It's
Oh yeah,
American
American Ag Credit.
Ad Credit. So it's basically farm loans and all the stuff. Some of the stuff I did, like being associated with Pharma Mac, where I did some consulting work way back in the day. But Scott has been kind of looking at both the frontier aspects of what does it mean to adopt AI technologies within an enterprise, but also brings in the grounded knowledge of what does it mean from a financial services perspective. And he has a PhD in nuclear physics. So I mean, like you kind of are working at particle levels from like decades now. So you know your stochastics, you know how, and you're probably ready for the quantum era, Scott. So we'll be looking at validating quantum models in the next few years. But it's a pleasure to have you again, Scott. So please take it away. Love to hear your thoughts.
All right, let me share my screen. Let's see. All right, are we up and running?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Please. Yeah.
All right. So, um, I think there's some confusion with the release of 26.2 of, what does it actually mean anymore if you're using generative AI? Is it even going to fit into your inventory? And if you do a review, are you going to call it a validation? So we're going to go through all that, but just a little bit about me. And I like to kind of gaslight people when I say that, I was training neural networks in 1994 as part of my physics research. So, I can say I've been doing this stuff since the last century, over the past 30 years. And, it tends to raise some eyebrows for folks that, may have been born in this century. So, that doesn't mean that I'm an expert in anything. I feel like I'm pretty well situated as far as model risk management and model validation goes. Worked at Charles Schwab for 11 years, worked my way up from being an individual to managing a large team, and then took a break and went over to the governance side in the farm credit system. So pretty much a 180 as far as the size of an institution, the maturity of their governance, and it's been kind of a breath of fresh air to see how things work in a different part of the financial system, and feel like I'm already making a difference there. And of course, the views here are my own, as caustic as they may be. And you'll find out, I think, that this is a curmudgeon corner here when it comes to my views on our regulatory situation with the release of 26.2. But let's go ahead and dive right in. Um, so very, very sadly, 11.7 was basically canceled and replaced by 26.2. But I feel like 11.7 is the old ways of doing things, where there was a lot of rigor that was introduced across the financial services industry with the guidance. Some of it was maybe a little bit too detailed and was treated as being prescriptive, but that did enforce a lot of rigor across banks in model risk management validation functions. And I think there's a lot of good stuff that we can still use. These core principles, conceptual soundness, effective challenge, model validation, performance monitoring. This is all pretty much the bread and butter of any oversight process for models that are used in financial services. And of course, I think that the core aspects that you need to demonstrate when you're talking about any model, it's all about the data. Does it make sense? Did you do your research for your model specification? Assumptions, limitations, these are all very important to identify, test, and monitor. And then, the performance monitoring, like if you can't do performance monitoring, is it really a model? So, that kind of feeds into the whole Gen AI topic as well. So 26.2, I think we're still digesting the impact of that, but especially in the context of Gen AI. Um, they say it only applies to non-generative and non-agentic AI models. So, okay, so we're saying that Gen AI is a model, but it's not a model. Copy that. But then we also say that our institutions' risk and governance practices should basically cover anything that might come up with any tool, process, or system that's not covered by 26.2. Okay, so we're not going to call it a model, and we're not going to do a model validation, but we should still do something, and maybe we call it validation. Maybe we call it something else. I don't know. But I think that this is this is where I have criticism for the regulators in that they just wholesale said, don't call Gen AI a model, but we're not going to tell you what to do. And so, I think a lot of institutions, like not that we had it nailed before, we were struggling before, and now it's even a little bit more ambiguous. So, I think it makes sense to try to think about where do we go when we have Gen AI? What makes sense to do from a model risk management, model validation, model governance perspective? If you go back to the old definition and you look for this subsequence here of text that I've put in, you can see that if you have an LLM, it does meet a definition of model. But as far as like validating an individual LLM from a vendor, it's going to be a very difficult, if not impossible, exercise because you don't have access to any of the data that they use to build it. You can't really get inside it and do sensitivity analysis. So, we just kind of have to take LLMs as being the black boxes that they are and make sure that we do adequate testing of processes that are built around them. Um, um, but now when it comes to the actual applications that your bank is using, do you want to call Copilot a model? Do you want to call the summary from Google, the AI summary from Google, a model? That's using generative AI, and it is not always accurate. Um, in fact, last month I was like, when is the next unemployment report? It's every Friday, right? It's been every Friday forever. And it's like, oh, the next report is on Thursday. It's like you're okay, you're wrong. So that even with the most advanced companies out there, the Googles and the large language models that they built, they still make mistakes. But can you validate that? In the Google search and Chrome, in Microsoft Copilot, and pretty much every vendor now has some type of like embedded search assistant that uses AI. Does it make sense to validate that stuff? It really doesn't. It really does not make sense to go there. But now, what should we be thinking about validating and potentially even classifying as models? So, and I want to compliment Tree. His cheat sheet for retrieval augmented generation, I think, is great. And I think that also lends itself to, there are some things in here that are very much like models that we used to see in the machine learning side of the world. There are choices that you can make, especially if you've built your own internal retrieval augmented generation system. You have a number of choices that you have to make. There are some things that you have to put together. And then from a validator standpoint, there is effective challenge that you can do, especially if it's all internal. You can build your own version. You can play with your own prompts. You can play with even the search algorithm. You can play with that too. So there's a lot of analysis that you can perform when it comes to retrieval augmented generation. But that brings me to today's topic, which is an actual AI workflow where you're using a large language model to perform a classification task. And think about this. if you're doing classification with a large language model, how is that any different from using XGBoost? It's the difference between text and numbers, probably, or even cat boost, where you have categories. So when you get to that level, you're thinking, okay, we really need to call this a model, and we need to draw from our experience of the past 15 years under 11.7 and do our due diligence. Um, Lastly, agents. I'm not going to go there because I haven't yet actually gone there. I think there's some thought leadership that is coming from folks such as Shri and elsewhere in the industry. We might have guidance, maybe someday. I don't know. We'll see. I think that is the next thing to come. But I think first, let's make sure we're pretty well grounded in just the typical workflow that's pretty well defined. Um, as far as guidance goes, um, there's this financial services AI risk management framework. So that draws from the NIST AI RMF. Um, it's pretty detailed, 230 control objectives. Uh, a lot of it is third party. In fact, the primary risk with generative AI is going to be third party risk unless you're building your own internal large language models or other such uh, generative AI models. But then there's a whole bunch of other things that they talk about in the FSAI RMF. There's compliance, legal, regulatory, privacy, data, technology, cyber. Also, a lot of human factors as far as training, acceptable use, human in the loop, and then there's a few model things. So really, when it comes to generative AI risk, um, GenAI is giving you an estimate for the best choice of words from one word to the next when you're using a large language model. But the risks are not necessarily all model. In fact, they're probably dominated by other risks out there, especially the regulatory and legal landscape. We have pretty much every state is contemplating, and some states have actually installed laws and regulations around AI, and AI is used for consumers, and it's creating this patchwork that is potentially going to be difficult to manage through as states produce conflicting laws and regulations. But I think the punchline for me is this: GenAI is not automatically a model. Don't automatically call GenAI applications a model just because it's using GenAI. Just like those co-pilots, just like those assistants, you can call it a model, and then what do you do? You've basically made a non-forced error because how do you produce a credible validation report for a tool that a lot of people aren't even going to use? Or they may use it, here and there sporadically. There's really no way of knowing if it's actually working correctly or not because everybody's going to be using it differently. All the inputs are different, all the outputs are different, all the experiences are different. It's almost like you just need to have a complaints mailbox where people say, I hate this thing and I'm not going to use it anymore. And so it's like you don't need to do model validation to find that out. But when GenAI starts looking like a model, so your retrieval augmented generation, your classification workflows, even agents that are designed to maybe draw from different tools to basically arrive at a desired outcome that you can measure. That's when we need to start thinking about, okay, let's call it a model and let's apply what we've learned about model validation over the past 15 years. And speaking of the FSA RMF, there are some things that do call out model risk management directly. I've copied them here. And really the punchline is two things. So one, if it looks like a model, let's call it a model and let's do a validation. But the other is there are things that we may not call models, But there is this idea of testing, evaluation, verification, validation. MRM is actually well suited to be performing, some of those tests. It's just not going to be the full end-to-end model validation project that we typically spend 2 or 3 months on. So, I think this is going to be, in my estimation, I feel like the industry is going to be evolving in this direction where, MRM will still do model validations, and then we may have folks from MRM, you know, or, or an AI governance function, right? Um, uh, So here we have the case study. This is some work I did at the beginning of the year. I was working for a bank who was contemplating adopting a GenAI tool to assist them with watchlist screening. And so watchlist screening is you have lists that are maintained by the Office of Foreign Asset Control and the financial FinCEN. I can't remember exactly, but it's on the next page. But basically, you don't want to be doing business with known criminals, with terrorists, people suspected of money laundering, and unfortunately, the only way that the people not to do business with is, you might have a name, you may have a location, you may have some additional details such as passports, driver's license, social security, dates of birth. But the process begins with a fuzzy logic approach of, do I have a name match? And then if I have a name match, I have an analyst team that looks at those alerts and dispositions them in a way of, no, this is a false positive, or yes, this is suspicious and we need to do additional research, and we may actually, in fact, have a match. But if you can imagine using fuzzy logic to match names, you're going to have a lot of false positive matches. And so there's always been this idea of how can we cut that 99, how many nines do you have in your 99.9 something false positive rate? How can we cut that back to, I don't know, 10%? That would be fantastic. So you need some type of advanced approach to do that. Yeah, I just wanted to go through really quick, the coverage here. So it's always interesting when model risk has an intersection with actual laws. If you are running a model that is violating the law, I mean that's much more problematic than just a model that is maybe misaligned to 11.7 and other regulations. Um, so the main laws that were the Bank Secrecy Act and the USA Patriot Act, which was that was like 2002, I think, after 9/11. And that gives us the OFAC list and also the Patriot Act 314A list. And I think most of you are familiar with all these other things, so I will just skip ahead. Okay, so what's the typical setup for a name comparison between the OFAC list and one of your customers? And so, I've invented a hypothetical bank customer here. He's Fred Smith. He sells poutine at Niagara Falls. He calls his food truck Vladimir's Poutine as a play on words. And I used AI to generate this cartoon, and I liked it because the potato head looks a lot like Viktor Orban. So I thought that was a neat thing to have. But basically, every customer you have to say, okay, I'm going to run all permutations of my customer names against the OFAC list. Fuzzy logic and tools typically uses Jaro, Winkler, Levenstein. There are some other techniques, Soundex. But basically, you're applying these across all permutations of the name of your customer against names on the list to see, do I have a potential match? And as you might expect as well, entities on the list may have multiple entries. So like Vladimir Putin has his first two names, but also Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin as well. And you have to compare that one too. But when we run the comparison for Fred Smith, who's doing business as Vladimir Putin, we see we get a 95% match for Vladimir Putin against Vladimir Putin. Um, but you might notice also there are other ways that you match the name, like Smith's Vladimir's. That gives you a score of 79. Typically speaking, the cutoff for these tools is, somewhere between 75 or 80, maybe as much as 85 if the bank has a lower risk profile. Okay, so what happens when we get an alert? So the human analyst is going to open up their dashboard and they're going to see our watch list entity is Vladimir Putin. Our alert entity is Fred Smith doing business as Vladimir Putin. We know Vladimir Putin, he's in Russia, he lives at the Kremlin, he was born in 1952. We don't really know anything else, but we know all the details of Fred Smith because he's our client. He's gone through the due diligence process. So we know that he runs a food truck. We know he's in Niagara Falls. We know his date of birth. He doesn't have a passport, but we know his social and his driver's license. And, lo and behold, the alert entity is a U.S. person who does not match the watch list entity. It takes the analyst maybe a minute to clear this alert. The reality, though, is when it comes to the OFAC list, it's, as you can see, you can go to the OFAC website and you can find out, who's on this list. Am I on the list? Well, if I'm on the list, then I'm not going to use my real name to do business. I'm going to find proxies to do business for me, which is what Vladimir Putin does. The end result is when we're doing the OFAC list comparisons, the false positive rates are, it's actually extremely rare to even get a true positive match because people just know not to do business. In fact, most of the matches aren't on the name side, it's really on the location side. So, someone who's maybe logged in from a sanctioned country, or region, Eastern Ukraine is particularly problematic because part of Ukraine is controlled by Russia, and it's oftentimes hard to tell which side of the line someone's on. But when it comes to where the meat of the problem is for banks, it tends to be more with 314A alerts. So these alerts are different. These are typically U.S. citizens that are engaged in some type of illegal activity where, effectively there's, instead of subpoenaing individual banks, they're just like putting out a list of names where they want banks to tell the regulator, is this person a client of yours or not? And then if they are, they will subpoena you directly. So it's a way of basically having a clearinghouse of, where do people do business so that investigators know where to focus their efforts. The list is also confidential, which means that people, generally speaking, don't know that they're on this list, so they don't try to practice evasion. But it's still pretty rare to get a hit of one of your clients against this list. So the typical 314A alert, and it's always a great day when you can work Breaking Bad into a presentation. So I've used myself as an example here. We have my name, Scott Walter Eilerts, compared to Walter White, who is a fictional drug kingpin in Albuquerque, who is a chemistry teacher and has invented the world's greatest recipe for methamphetamines. We have the same birth month, but we have mismatching driver's license and social security numbers. And so when this alert goes to the analyst, this is what they see. They see that we matched on the names at 80% using Jara That's why we got the alert. But then the human quickly does a review and says, okay, we have mismatching socials and driver's licenses. And so this alert is disposition. And again, this takes them maybe about a minute. But what if we want to replace the analyst with generative AI? Okay, so now we're talking, right? Now we're talking about, okay, we've got this 99 point something% false positive rate that maybe we can manage down to, 10% would be like amazing, right? That would be like basically a 90% reduction in the labor required to disposition these things. So we use a workflow approach. Basically, we take all the information that you saw before. Um, we send that information to a generative AI model. In this case, they were using Claude Sonnet. There's a prompt that requires Sonnet to perform the comparison and deliver the results in a structured output, which theoretically reduces hallucinations. The vendor in their testing, they used over 1,000 confirmed matches from multiple institutions. So I think they did a decent job at having a fairly broad spectrum of matches for their training. And so what we do from the bank side is we are going to perform a validation. We're going to call this a model. And another like huge benefit is we actually have a validation report template that is tailored to generative AI. So we don't have to worry about things like stress testing. We're not going to do stress testing with this. It would be nice if we could do sensitive analysis, but we'll see that that's going to be a problem. And we have some testing outcomes from the vendor as well. They did 2 tests for us. They just tested a sample of alerts for 1 month. And then they also tested all of our historical true positives to make sure we don't have a false negative, because as you know, false negatives in this space can attract a lot of unwanted regulatory scrutiny. All right, so we take our example. We're running myself against Walter Wright again. We have the match, and then this is the output that the tool gives us. And just want to pause here and think, this does not look like the output. One of the concerns that you would have here from an AML officer's standpoint is there's a lot of information that we're getting back, and maybe it's too much information. And so what it's going to do is going to say, okay, so we matched on a name, but we don't match on other names. We're close geographically. We have the same birth month, birth year. But then, there's no match for driver's license. I'll just alert and move on to the next. But again, my criticism of this tool is, you can make this decision pretty quickly just based on mismatching socials and driver's licenses. You don't really need to go through all this additional detail, because guess what? We know that generative AI sometimes produces the wrong text. It produces hallucinations, and the more that you ask it to do, the more likely it is that you're going to run into that sort of thing. So unfortunately, we don't have control over the tool in production, and so we can't really, pretty much what we see here is what we get. And so that was the feedback that I provided to the bank. As far as using this tool, well, first of all, they had no internal documentation, so I don't think they had even really thought about the implications of using this. The true implications. What does it mean as far as how do we train our people? How do we make sure we're preserving the skills of our analyst team? How do we, manage the automation bias, which is a huge problem when you have human in the loop. And this goes back, we've known about automation bias for decades now. I would encourage everyone to read the story of the UK post office where they had this audit tool that was frequently wrong, but it caused people to commit suicide when they lost their jobs and got fined for things that they never did that the audit tool said that they did. So, it's been out there for a long time, this idea of automation bias. And I think it's one of the things where, while training counteract that, I think it remains to be seen. So, human in the loop has its own problems, for one. And then this being a vendor tool, they have, well, documentation was as thin as 5 sheets of paper. So you can imagine that they provided no details. We didn't know what the settings were. They would not share those settings. We were not able to perform any sensitivity analysis around those settings. Pretty much all we could do was send alerts to it and see what came out, and try to make sure that we had identified limitations and controls accordingly. Probably the worst thing though was it was just underwhelming to me. 50% of alerts it would disposition, when we know that effectively 100% of alerts are false positives, right? You might, out of 1,000 or 10,000 alerts, even out of 10,000 alerts, you might get one hit. So we know, like you can always hold the model and just say like everything's a false positive, and we don't investigate, and of course that would get you in trouble, but it would be more accurate. Uh, so accuracy doesn't mean much in this context, but you could actually build, and this is one of the things I did. I built a deterministic tool and just said, if we have a mismatch in the social or driver's license, we just, call it a non-match. And, that gets you 40% right out the door. So, we don't need to even use GenAI to kind of approach the performance of this tool. And then I really don't like that they had like the full ad nauseum explanation. I did not think that was necessary. It was really just more of a what factors did you use to decide if this alert could be acknowledged and dispensed of, or if it needed further investigation. Usually you should say, we acknowledge this alert because we mismatched social security in a driver's license, or we need to investigate this alert because we don't have enough information to make a decision. You can just leave it at that, and maybe in some type of backend tool you have access to additional chain of thought or other type of explainable AI stuff. But my thinking here is that whatever you put in front of a regulator, it basically has to be perfect, because otherwise they are not going to trust the tool. And will you even trust the tool if what you're seeing is just a lot of, excessively wordy stuff? So they don't like that. The other thing is, it was very sensitive to the version of Sonnet that was being used. They repeated the testing for version 3.5 and 4.5, and there was not, there's maybe not a lot of misalignment. Like from a qualitative standpoint, it was saying the same thing, but from a automated monitoring standpoint with metrics like Rouge, it was difficult to say that you would be able to do automated monitoring and have confidence that you don't have drift, because just these slide version changes produce pretty dramatic differences in your Rouge scores. So they were going to have to maybe think about using some type of scorecard on samples of alerts to see, did the tone, did the factors identified, are those changed at all or not, to ensure stability over time. And of course, it hallucinated. the geographic proximity was one of the things that tended to bite it the most often. There were cases where two parties were within 100 miles of each other, and sometimes it would say they were in close proximity if they were within 100 miles, and other times it could be in different states. Um, and it would say that they're in close proximity there, or vice versa. If they were close by each other, it would say they're more than 100 miles apart. So again, that's not something that you want to be showing your regulator. Um, so what did we learn from this? E- the validation approaches and skills that we've learned in the past 15 years from SR 11.7, may it rest in peace. These are still very, very strong, very powerful um, techniques that we have. We're applying it to words. And we know that the words are potentially inaccurate. Potentially it's going to give you the wrong date. It's going to give you the wrong distance. It's going to give you the wrong something. It's going to make the wrong conclusion. The challenging thing, of course, with GenAI is that everything that it says it just sounds completely confident, like it's giving a lecture at Oxford University. It's going to make it difficult to spot those clear inaccuracies and hallucinations, because if you just read it without thinking, it looks right. So we have to be careful around that. And that kind of also goes into the automation bias problem. Um, it's one of those things of, can we train people enough to always be kind of on alert for text that's going to look correct but actually be inaccurate? Will they maintain almost a hyper vigilance level when they're looking at outputs of generative AI in this type of context? So that's another thing where I think the industry has some work to do. And again, anytime you have a vendor tool like this, they're going to say it's their secret sauce. It's the greatest thing ever. They're not going to tell you how it works. They're not going to give you much, if any, information. But we've seen this before, right? Within the model risk space, we've always had vendor models, and they've always been stingy at providing details. And we always find ways to kind of tease out the stuff that's important. And we have to do the same thing here. Um, I already criticized the use of like basically using the full chain of thought in the output. I don't think you should really do that. I think less is always more, especially with Gen AI, where you want it to be as precise as possible, and you should be constructing the workflow to make it that way. You can save off chain of thought somewhere else, or other explainability things someplace else, and look at that offline if you need to. Um, and the last thing is, I think the monitoring of this type of application is still going to be a challenge for folks. Um, do we do sampling with human, qualitative scorecard factors? Or are there other things that we could do, like using a different LLM to challenge the output and potentially spot inaccuracies that way? Maybe. But I think that's also things that we're going to be sorting out here in the next few years as an industry. So again, the grand conclusion, um, if it looks like a model, if it's using GenAI, call it a GenAI model. If you have a GenAI template, that's great news for you. That will make your life easier, because you don't have to do a lot of the testing that you might do for a financial model. And then perform a validation that uses the skills that we already have from following the old ways of SR 11.7. And so I will leave it at that. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to answer the best I can.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. This was an amazing presentation. And is this presentation something we can share with the audience later?
Yes, I'll send you a PDF after we're done.
Perfect, perfect. So I will make sure that all the participants and also registrants get access to to this presentation. I think there are a couple of questions, so I have some of my own, but let me kind of address some of the questions slash comments from the audience, and then we can kind of have a brief discussion. So one, I have a question from Wen. Is possible could Mr. or Dr. Let's provide some details about the validation of the watchlist case. Was a validation via human review and labeling of the test samples, so essentially benchmarking against human review?
That's correct. Yeah. So we started with previously dispositioned alerts. So we had identified those that were false positives, and then there were a handful of true positives in the monthly test sample that we used. And then also we had all previously confirmed true positives going back a couple of years. So it was all human labeled.
Okay, good. And then the second question is more generic. The question about validating small language models, since organizations may be building with their own financial data. Do you think small language models are becoming popular, since that may be a case for model validation?
Well, certainly if you're building something internally, which I'm assuming that's what we mean by a small language model, is that you're using your own internal data to construct it, then absolutely. You can call that a model and do a validation. Now, what does that validation look like? There again, I don't think we've seen enough
Mm,
examples or case studies to really establish that. But in my mind, that's when we are saying, since this is not some type of industry standard approach like you would have from an Anthropic or Google or OpenAI, you're building it internally, and you're probably more likely
mhm.
to see mistakes being made by the developers. And so validation, I would say is also imperative in those cases.
Absolutely. So I may want to switch gears a little bit in here. I mean, I've been reading and processing a lot of information about agentic AI systems, and the number of frameworks are growing. We haven't seen very many agentic applications in the financial services world, which are widely talked about. Maybe there are still prototypes being developed. People may be using it for some niche use cases, primarily workflow driven. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how does it change the game? Because now we have a lot more non-determinism brought into the picture, not only in the context of a model, an LLM, generating answers which may not be reproducible apples to apples, but also there is this process piece wherein by design we may be incorporating things which could potentially be a trial based one. So I'm trying many times and I'm potentially using web search or any other tools. And depending on the results, I may be making decisions. Validation of multiple moving parts is always a hard challenge. Any thoughts on how do we kind of extend our current thinking from traditional statistical models to traditional GenAI models at this point, if you will? I would consider a RAG application as a traditional GenAI model to agentic applications.
Yeah, that's I think the next big question of we have you can I guess it depends on the agent. Like, is the agent just simply trying to answer a question? Um, so you can do things like, what types of questions might you be asking?
Mm,
The developers, should have maybe a set of standard questions that they will always be using to use for benchmarking and stability testing over time. You can have your own
mhm,
questions as well. But I think it just depends on, what tools will the agent have available to it? Is it going to be calling those tools? Does it tend to get trapped in loops and then not be able to provide an answer? Like, how do you exit the loop where no answer is forthcoming? What safeguards are in place?
mhm.
Um, And then, but it's not always, it's not all model here. I mean, particularly if you have something that is customer facing, the risks sort of go up exponentially in those cases, especially in a financial services context where you have fiduciary obligations as well. You have lots of regulatory requirements. Everything you say needs to be as accurate as you can possibly make it, right? Because you don't want to be giving people the wrong answer.
Mhm.
I've seen examples out there where people can even internal or external, they can ask questions of an AI in such a way that it finds these workarounds
Mm.
to internal processes as well. So there's the potential for like unacceptable use. How do you manage that? Do you do red teaming? You probably shouldn't be
Mm.
doing red teaming if it's public facing. So I think there's a lot of things outside of just model validation that need to be brought to bear in those cases. But when it comes to validation of agentic AI, I think again we have to put on our thinking caps and go back to our skills of how can this fail
Mm.
from a model risk standpoint. And how can we design testing? How can we run sensitivity analysis? How can we approach this in a way where we have confidence that we've given it a thorough review and we feel like it's going to be fit for purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges, I mean, as I'm kind of building out some of the examples for the courses I'm teaching, and this is something will be once the FSP consultation, I think it's due on the 12th, so we are finalizing that. I'll post that on LinkedIn. One of the things I'm thinking of is, the drivers, right? So because they're all driven, not, you don't just pass in a set of static inputs and have all these processes kick in and you get a result. You have a lot of levers you are expected to control, and that still remains in the hands of either the developer or even someone and as an end user, right? So things like, I mean, even a prompt, I mean, like, a plain text prompt which a user is given through a text box interface which an end user is expected to provide. Now, that prompt itself, I usually treat it as code, because that is being the driver for my system, whatever that process would look like, and to act upon it. And then you have aspects of what the system prompts are, what the user prompts are, what other parameters goes into it through context engineering, dynamic context engineering. Based on the prompts, now you're extracting stuff from RAG and you're providing that dynamically as context. Then tools which are invoked even to do basic things like web search, but also invocation of databases, associated permission levels, finding the right bits of information so that you could potentially put together an answer. And then also the number of tries. How many tries are you kind of allowed, and what are the limiting factors which will say, okay, now I'm done. How do you even think about managing memory? Because now you have access to memory, both static and dynamic, as you're kind of building out your trajectory towards a solution, right? So the validator's job is going to be exponentially hard, not only because there isn't a pass in XYZ, you're going to get this particular output, but you have all these other levers along the way which you can potentially change. But then it becomes like a combinatorial problem, like, how many permutations and combinations can you even test to ensure that the outputs are sane enough that you can say, okay, it's ready for production. Now, I'm kind of becoming a big fan of this process validation piece rather than the actual model validation piece, because now you're dealing with a bunch of processes kind of daisy chained to kick off before you can get back a solution. Some of them deterministic, database access, you provide a query, you get back a response that's deterministic, I can test it atomically. But then I have to build in my entire process to get either an autonomous or a semi-autonomous or a gating process where there's a human in the loop. So as the complexity increases, I'm sorry, I'm kind of giving you a lot of context, but also in some ways wanting to make sure that you understand where I'm coming from. Now you started as a nuclear physicist, and you've kind of worn your, financial services hat over time. You've built enough expertise so you have the context, and you're picking up on the AI and the computer science literature. A lot of people in this audience, and also people who are going to be reviewing these videos, are people who are starting out their careers, or people mid-level, folks who are trying to figure out, like, am I the right person to being the whole thing, or should I be picking up more skills, or should I be working with more first line folks, or technology folks, or operations risk folks? How do we kind of assign responsibilities for managing all these things? And also, what is this notion of residual risk? Because things which I haven't thought of will get dumped into a risk bucket, which somehow needs to be managed. And the unknown unknowns potentially could be managed if you know and assign responsibility. So how do we see this whole trajectory evolving over time?
Well, it is bringing in new skill sets for sure. Um, we if we're talking about model validation, we are an expert um, in decomposing complex systems into parts, and these systems are just they're more complex, and there are more non-model-like things associated with them that we have to learn about. And I think we're not going to be the only ones, so we're probably not going to be the team that's going to do red team testing
Mm-hmm.
of an agent if it's public facing. We don't need to have law degrees to understand the implications of, a wrong answer for, regulatory violations. But, I think it is a matter of, understanding as best as we can, just where things go, and where things can go wrong. I think that's still what we've always done as model validators.
Mm-hmm.
How can this go wrong? And it's going to be a matter of, potentially picking up more skill sets because agents have skills now, right? And so we
Yep.
need to be testing, those skills. We need to be finding, is there a way to detect anomalies when they occur? How do we do monitoring?
Mm.
These are all things that, again, there are commonalities between agentic AI and models, but can we adapt our skills to those, and still be making judgments and identifying issues,
Mm-hmm.
and confirming that this is going to be fit for purpose. But yeah, I think it is, as best as we can understand, how everything works. So, be build our own agents, build our own workflows. Get your hands on these tools, and make sure you understand how things work, how things go wrong, and then apply those lessons to the agents and workflows as they come in, and do the aspects of testing that are kind of within your scope
Mm.
as a model validator or as an AI governance person. And I think we're going to maybe see, there may be a fork here where generative and agentic AI, they call it the testing, evaluation,
Mm.
verification, validation. There may be basically a class of analysts now that their focus is generative and agentic AI,
Mm.
and testing, because you don't necessarily need to know all of the like financial modeling concepts to do validations of generative and agentic AI. So yeah, I think again, model risk management was well positioned to answer a lot of questions at the beginning when it came to generative AI. But I think we will see an evolution towards more of an AI risk management function that is complementary to model risk management.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And thank you so much for your thoughts, Scott. This was an excellent presentation. Learned a lot from your session. And as I mentioned, next week we're going to have Agus Sugianto, who headed model risk at Wells Fargo. So he's going to be doing a 2-hour workshop on how to think about agentic architectures in the context of production. And Scott, we will love to hear back again as you build more stuff. Let's keep in touch. And thank you again for your wonderful presentation. And people in the audience, as I mentioned, the
My
second
pleasure.
cohort is starting on July 21st. The registrations are still open. We're going to try and keep the classes small so that we can invoke a lot of discussion. We have a lot of professionals who are in the room, and Scott took our course a few years ago, and you can imagine, like, in a small room setting, we can discuss these issues at depth so that when you go back to your offices, you're actually in the mode of practicing rather than thinking about, oh, I learned a few concepts, what do I do with this kind of a thing. So I would love to involve you with the discussion. Even if you don't join our classes, that's fine. Please make sure that you engage in these guest lectures. That way you can actively contribute to the discussion and see how we can evolve the profession in a way wherein we can share what we know, but also incorporate the best practices from other realms so that we can make this process more robust as we continue evolving this profession. Thanks again, everyone, and we will see you soon in another guest lecture series. Take care. See you.